To extraordinary business, there's no notice of extraordinary business, so we will move now to item 8 and then to item 9. And if I can call up David Hawkey and Ryan Falconer is the author of this report, item 8, sorry. And that's on page 11. This is the Land Transport Legislation Bill, the Rail Bill. And Ryan, maybe if you can introduce yourselves and the roles you've been undertaken. I understand there has been quite a lot of dialogue over the period when a lot of us have been enjoying a break. Our staff have been beavering away because this was a very late notification out of government. 19th of December? So it gives you an idea, members, that a lot of our staff have not enjoyed the beach towel as much as some others. Introduce the item and firstly the staff and Auckland Transport, of course, and the role that Auckland Transport's been undertaking as well. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. So I have David with me from Auckland Council, and also on my left-hand side, Luke Elliott, who's a Principal Transport Planner with Auckland Transport. Provide a little bit of added context before I provide a summary. This has come out of a long period of negotiation that Auckland Transport and Auckland Council staff have been involved with staff from the Ministry of Transport. So over quite a period of time, I believe around 18 months, there's been intermittent dialogue around the matters of reform, some of which we'll discuss today. And as you have pointed out, Mr. Chair, we have had relatively short time frame to respond to this particular call for submissions. So to just provide a summary of the content, a bit of background, the submission pertains to legislative change, and the intent of the change is to enable rail sector reform. The legislation relates specifically to heavy rail, so it doesn't include light rail. Light rail is not included in this legislative reform as proposed. The intent of the reform is to establish a long-term planning and funding system for rail in a manner relatively consistent with other forms of land transport, so in other words, funded via the National Land Transport Fund. And this is national in focus, and there is, of course, a regional imperative to that as well. Simultaneously, the Ministry of Transport has invited informal comments from staff pertaining to the draft National Rail Plan. That's a separate document. The draft National Rail Plan establishes a 10-year vision for rail in New Zealand, and formal consultation will occur later this year concurrently with the draft government policy statement on land transport. And we would propose that staff continue to provide informal comments through to the Ministry as part of current working arrangements, and take the opportunity to submit formally, should we wish to as a council, simultaneously with the GPS. The proposed legislation, so the legislation itself, which we're submitting on, reflects what we would summarise as a partial integration model for planning, assessing and funding rail and other forms of land transport. It defines an approval pathway for something called the Rail Network Investment Program, which is essentially a 3-year program that will define projects or priority areas for government to invest in, with the Minister of Transport being the ultimate decision maker with respect for rail activities to be funded, and that would be in consultation with KiwiRail's other shareholding ministers and following provision of advice and consideration of that advice from the New Zealand Transport Agency. In contrast, a full integration model would treat rail in a similar manner, or the same manner as other forms of land transport, with specific investment propositions subject to review and approval of the NZTA board. So there's a clear distinction between the partial integration model proposed and that full integration model, and I'll come back to that momentarily in terms of recommendations for council. So briefly regarding our principal concerns, the proposed legislation, some of the principal concerns relate to the risk of misalignment between a regional land transport plan and the RNIP, or the Rail Network Investment Program. because of differing development review and approval pathways. So that's distinctly via the Minister on one hand for ARNIP, and on the other hand for the RLTP via the NZTA board. And then, of course, the potential for misalignment between regional prioritisation and national prioritisation of projects and programs. There are also potential implications for our Auckland Network Access Agreement, and specifically this is why we have representation from AT today to provide potentially a little bit more detail around this. To provide a bit more information for members, the Access Agreement is the key mechanism that assures the successful functioning of our metropolitan passenger operations, and it does provide long-term certainty around costs and provision of fees to KiwiRail, and it is an effective mechanism to hold KiwiRail to account for the state of the rail network. Because of the legislative changes proposed, we would see impacts on track user charges, the track user charge regime, and the risk is because the bill doesn't make direct reference to our access agreements, it's the consequences for those access agreements as implementation commences. So at this time, we've been informed there is no near-term expectation of changes to those agreements, but it's really the opening of risk associated with future changes to those agreements. Prior to summarising our key submission points and recommendations, we'll make a comment briefly regarding climate impact. So I think it's important to point out that we cannot make a direct climate impact assessment of the bill as it deals with prioritisation and programs, not specific projects at this time. However, the establishment of a longer-term focus for rail planning and investment in New Zealand is undoubtedly a positive thing, and all things being equal, the integration of rail with other modes of transport via the GPS and the National Land Transport Fund likely to be climate positive. So in terms of our recommendations, we do certainly strongly support the reform and underlying intent of reform in the sector, particularly the establishment of longer-term planning and more secure funding and investment. We do not support or oppose specific clauses of the proposed legislation pertaining to processes for the development of ARNIP compared to the RLTP, and the review and approval of these plans and programs, and also the potential impacts on our network access agreement. So we would recommend full integration of rail instead into the land transport planning and funding system and preservation of the access agreement. I would also request of the committee that there is a reply to an additional recommendation that we will make, and apologies, this was not included in our committee report, but on reflection, we would be recommending to the Select Committee that the ARNIP has an adjusted time horizon from 3 years, so moving from being a 3-year investment program to a 10-year investment program with prioritisation on the first 3 years. That would grant more power to this longer-term planning horizon and approach, would enable a degree of added consistency with the draft National Rail Plan, and also draw in more consistency with our RLTP and LTP processes. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Just before we take questions, there are a lot of acronyms in this report, and most of them have been explained, but the ANA is probably a new one to most of us. That's the access agreement. But do you want to maybe just, the Rail Network Investment Program, this is an important one here, and just distinguishing, ATAP, RLTP, Auckland Transport Alignment Project, I should say, Regional Land Transport Plan, Regional Transport Committee, the Access Agreement, National Land Transport Program, etc. Do you want to just take us through some of those? Because I think we need to understand how all these plans mesh and fit. Just very briefly. Now that is quite a task, but I don't want to leave the members not understanding these plans and programs.
Look, happy to, and I'll probably invite David to provide a broader picture, and then I can supplement that with some added discussion and clarification around how ARNIP, or the Rail Network Investment Program, would fit with that broader framework, particularly under the proposed partial integration framework.
Thank you, Ryan. I suppose.
Yes. No, it's not.
Thank you. Through the chair, I suppose if we're walking walking through the hierarchy of these plans, I think the first one to cover is the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, which in effect is a non-statutory plan. So in effect, that is a bunch of agencies through the Minister and the Mayor deciding on a program for Auckland over a longer period of time. And currently that is a 30-year horizon, but on the whole, the 10 years. But first thing to realise, it is a non-statutory plan, but rail is a part of that plan. Through Auckland Transport and the Board of Auckland Transport, which has the authority as the Regional Transport Committee for Auckland, there is the regional regional land transport plan for Auckland, which literally is a 10-year horizon plan which sets out the, investment program of transport for Auckland, and in effect is asking for joint funding from Auckland Council through that long-term plan, and also through NZTA to get funding through the National Land Transport Fund. The new plan, which is the ARNIP, is the National Plan for Rail, primarily focused on heavy rail and Kiwi Rail's part of heavy rail. But because we own parts of the rail network involved, in effect, we are part of that plan. So that would be a national plan. At the moment, it's proposed to be looked at every 3 years. It is a 3-year horizon at the moment, which is quite a short horizon. But I suppose what some of the things to think about in terms of this submission and why there could be misalignment is the timing of these plans isn't running in exactly parallel. So in effect, the Regional Land Transport Plan, which would be led by Auckland Transport, with input from Kiwi Rail and Auckland Council and others, would be completed earlier than the ARNIP plan. So in effect, you could have a situation that wouldn't be attended, but the legislation doesn't address this specifically, that we finish the regional regional land transport plan. There's some differences of opinion with government, and the minister ultimately makes a decision to change the ARNIP plan, and then in effect would have a misalignment between those plans. So I suppose a lot of this submission is saying that ideally, on an on-principle basis, we would prefer rail to be treated the same as other modes of transport and currently go through the same sort of processes. So that's what it's about. So the big, I suppose, potential risk of this new bill is misalignment with government on key pieces of rail infrastructure which could affect Auckland. So, I mean, that's the essence of it, really. And I suppose, there has been discussion with the ministry on this. There has been a lot of confirmation that we'll work together and, we'd try to work around such things. But I suppose what we're saying on a principle basis is that you should always hope for the best, but plan for the worst. So at the moment, the current bill isn't so clear about what happens in terms of misalignments and how those are resolved and what it means for Auckland. So that's one of our key recommendations to the Select Committee, is that we move to a more integrated sort of option which would reduce the risk of misalignment.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions first, and I'll go to other members. So, look, we're generally it's good to see the bill change the status quo, because that needed to be changed. We acknowledge that, and we are asking in our submission to go further, to have an alignment with the balance of the land transport network, full integration, as opposed to what the Ministry of Transport and the ministers, the plural, are proposing here, which is option 3, wasn't it? And 4 was full integration.
Option 3, that's correct. That's partial integration.
And so that's the thrust of our consideration here today: partial integration versus full integration, as we have for the balance of the land transport system. Now, second part to that question, or second question really, is there are other significant submissions coming in. Local Government New Zealand are submitting on this. Oh no, I'll ask you, Luke, to outline Auckland Transport's separate submission, and because I think the committee needs to understand what is the rest of New Zealand saying. Do we know what the other big cities are saying? Wellington, which has got a big interest in rail, and also Christchurch, Local Government New Zealand, and then Luke, can we come to you for Auckland Transport?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me just comment briefly there that the development of council submission has been done closely with AT, and while AT is submitting separately a joint submission with Greater Wellington, there is a high degree of consistency between the content of our submission. So I'll invite Luke to elaborate a bit further.
Firstly, can we take the local government New Zealand submission? I understand that they might be looking more towards full integration as well.
My apologies, yes. So from what we've seen of that draft submission, there is again a great deal of consistency with our own, and in particular they are quite firm in terms of recommending full integration as opposed to partial integration for similar reasons.
Thank you. And Luke for Auckland Transport.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Ryan. As Ryan has mentioned, Auckland Transport's submission is aligned with Auckland Council's, and we're also making a submission jointly with Greater Wellington Regional Council, who share the same concerns. So in the same way that we have the Auckland Network Access Agreement with KiwiRail, Greater Wellington has their own agreement, which is essentially the same. So our two key concerns are firstly that integration with the regional land transport planning process that's been discussed, and as was mentioned, the preservation of the details of those network access agreements, which are what enable us to essentially hold KiwiRail to account for the performance of our services on their network.
It's clear. Now we'll go to questions. Councillor Henderson, then Councillor Dalton, then Councillor Cashmore, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually have two questions, and this relates to the draft plan itself rather than the enabling bill. I actually gave feedback to the plan over summer. How is that feedback incorporated?
Through the chair. So thank you for the feedback. Yes, that was received. At this time, we have not had the opportunity to re-engage with the ministry around the particular comments raised, which we would intend to do moving forward, particular to the draft National Rail Plan rather than to the bill itself.
Thank you. And my second question just relates to what I think might be the most important point from my perspective. So I note the National Rail Plan does not include much on the port study. So given that any shift of port operations necessitates rail upgrades, and it's been suggested in the port study that an inland port may be looked at in the northwest, and such a move may impact residents on the Western Train Line, where does the National Rail Plan fit in with the port study work?
Through the chair, I think at this point it would probably be fair to say that the National Rail Plan probably couldn't comment too much on the port study, and we're aware of work underway, quite detailed work being run by the Ministry of Transport and Treasury, investigating a range of different options for the port. So my suggestion would be it would be quite premature for particular details pertinent to a port option to be included in that plan. In future versions of the plan updates, I would expect some details to emerge.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Luke. Tēnā koe, Luke. You said that Auckland Transport submission is aligned to Auckland Council's. Can you confirm that Auckland Transport is recommending full integration?
Through the chair, yes, we are.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks. I think the premise of this bill is welcomed by everybody because we haven't had a national investment program in rail, since Adam was a cowboy, and it's drastically overdue. But are we being courageous enough in talking about a 3-year focus and a 10-year funded? Should we be able to expend that given the actual capital cost and depreciation rate of rail and the lack of modern rail technology in this country as far as signal systems and replacing tracks? It's all stuff back based on 1950s compared to what is international best practice these days. So are we being ambitious enough is what I'm asking.
Through the chair. Thank you, Councillor. That's an excellent question, and I think there's probably two parts to the response. Part one would be that the National Rail Plan draft, albeit it has a primary 10-year focus, it also talks about future and emergent priorities, and we would expect over time as that evolves for more focus on what can we do down the track, pun intended I suppose, to really be elevated. And I would suggest that when we have certainly during the informal consultation process and particularly during the formal consultation process, we might take the opportunity to emphasise the need to be a little bit more bold and ambitious with our timeframes. The second response, or second part of the response, would be the the discussion, that we've had to date have really been around from the perspective of KiwiRail around improving the state of repair of the current infrastructure, and we'd anticipate the first iteration or two of the network improvement program to focus on essentially raising the state of the current network rather than being particularly ambitious and bold outside of metropolitan regions, particularly ours and Wellington's. So again, we would expect to see the RNIP evolve into subsequent time periods.
Mr. Chair, the reason I'm asking, in a few years' time, CRL lands and a potential doubling of the capacity of the network for the metro. And as we've seen when we've charged ahead with old infrastructure, with our half-owned new carriages and the frequency of units, the system falls over. And I'm really concerned that we are going to see a denigration of the infrastructure in the metro area because of our increasing use and KiwiRail's lack of finances to deliver a system that's actually capable of that use. And we've seen that happen in recent years as the network's expanded. So,
thank you for the Chair. Look, I think that's a great point, and I suppose that the positive thing to take out of here is there's an ongoing dialogue with the Ministry and KiwiRail when we develop these plans. So they're the sort of points that we could push through our discussions with them. I think another thing too, the big real sort of mind shift around the RNIP is it has moved away from the concept of KiwiRail being an organisation that's in managed decline. So I think moving away from that is a great positive step forward. And I think you did right that there's a lot of investment work to go in the future with these things coming online.
And Councillor Coombe.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Chair. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for the work that's gone into this over the summer. It's more of a query and a comment and then a query that's more perhaps for the Chair. Just in terms of the substantive point of the submission, it is quite varied. It takes till you get to sort of paragraph 19 before you can really find it. So there's a lot of the preamble, and without trying to get into the sort of drafting of it, I just wondered if we could just make our key points just very much more upfront, because it is quite technical and there's a lot of information to absorb, but just to try and find where we're saying what our key points are. And if I understood correctly, you made a comment that, Ryan, that there is probably a little bit more that needs to go into the submission around the length of the plan. Needs to be a longer timing window for the plan, in which case I just wondered, Mr. Chair, if you've got enough coverage of your resolution, it's more than a minor amendment, because I just want to make sure you feel comfortable being able to finalise this and include everything that's been picked up today, because I hear that as more than a minor amendment and I don't want you to be kind of hamstrung. So just an observation about how the submission is coming together, but feel very confident with the work that is being done and that we're very much aligned on what feedback we need to give. So thank you for that.
Okay, I need to check that with the members though. If I was to take the word minor out, myself and the Deputy Chair, we would be consulting with also the Mayor's office. We would not be making substantive changes, but they might be more than minor. If I give that assurance to the members, are the members comfortable with the word minor coming out? So it would be the Chair, Deputy and the Mayor's office, effectively the Mayor, having oversight of the amendments. Are members comfortable with that? But the thrust is supporting full integration, not partial integration. But I do have a question. Can I just check, members? I'll ask, is that okay with the members? I'm getting nods yes, and then I'll Councillor Dalton.
I'm just not quite so sure about that. I mean, I think it was actually a really good report. And submission, I think it's quite clear. It's big. There's a lot in there, so I thought that it was written quite well. I don't know that there are any major amendments that you're going to be making.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is about the interpretation of minor, and maybe Councillor Coombe has an interpretation. I was just trying to resolve this quickly. But my feeling is we can probably deal with it under the wording as it is now. Can I just clarify though, should our submission be strong in the direction of full integration without the backstop of partial integration, if you like, government, and tweak it this way, which is what we're saying here. So I guess it's more of a fundamental question. When I hear Local Government New Zealand, Auckland Transport with Greater Wellington, I'm not sure what Environment Canterbury's position is, you've got Local Government New Zealand and transport agencies all saying, this is fantastic government, but go the full distance on this now, go to full integration, don't go halfway house. So why would you want to give government an out by recommending some word tweaks in favour of partial integration when our real request is to go for full integration?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My view personally would be that we should draw a line in the sand and put forward the full integration option without the backstop. I would suggest that there are opportunities, should full integration not be adopted, to negotiate some of the more challenging provisions as we go, but that without the guarantees of appropriate legislation and framework, a planning framework above us. So my personal view would be that, yes, we do focus on full integration.
We'll take a response from the Director of Strategy, but just before that, from AT's point of view, Luke?
So in terms of our draft submission, which is yet to be approved by our board, we have not presented a backstop. We are just recommending full integration, and that's it.
So no backstop from AT, you're bidding for full integration?
Correct.
Thank you. And Director of Strategy.
So through the chair, so Ryan and I discussed this, and it certainly was his advice that you would just go full integration. I asked him to look at, should that not occur, and given that the recommendation at the moment from the ministry is partial, let's assume there could well be a more than 50% chance that it's just partial, that in that case, it's kind of to David's point about, planning for the worst. If it was partial, then at least we have been very clear about, at the very least, we would like these changes to be made, which is going to be better for us. So there's no right and wrong here. I just wanted to say that Ryan was very clear in his advice. I asked him to do more, and effectively put a backstop, if you want to call it that, in your hands about what is best.
Okay, so we need to remember, members, this is not finalised until we vote on it. So I need to have your feedback. We've heard from our transport infrastructure team. We've heard that that Auckland Transport with Greater Wellington is bidding for full integration. Am I hearing support for going the full distance and bidding for full integration? Yes. Yes? Are there contrary views? That is going for a backstop? In addition to full integration?
Yes, so through the chair, I'm not suggesting we don't go full integration. All I'm saying is that we're just assisting the drafters in the ministry to say, in case you don't agree with us, we believe there are key things for us that you should change. That's all. I think we should focus for full as well. This is just and we're helping you draft it if you don't do what we ask. Right.
Councillor Cooper? Thank you. So, in summary, there is a determination to go for full integration and put little weight on the backstop words. Is that correct? Okay. And look, we'll check this, Councillor Bartley and myself will check it with the Mayor's office, Mayor, before it goes out. Anything else to add here, members? It is moved and seconded, so people can speak to it. Councillor
To a point
Casey?
you raised at the beginning, Mr. Chairman, with regard to the number of acronyms, could we just have in our submission, can you just list them at the back and see what they are? Thank you.
Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I mean, just to emphasise the point there in terms of the issue that Councillor Dalton raised, the words minor amendments are remaining there, as is the usual custom. So just to ensure that in fact is the understanding.
Yep, yeah, we covered that, and we'll just sit with that wording as it is. That's fine. And then taking into account the feedback here today. Okay, thank you. Look, it would be unfair of us to suggest that this is not a worthy bill. It is a big advance from where we have been for decades. Rail is, we've lost sight of rail in New Zealand until recently. So I acknowledge government. I think we all here at Auckland Council acknowledge government's move in bringing rail back and looking at long-term planning, long-term funding mechanisms. That excites us. I'm sure provincial New Zealand as well. Probably provincial New Zealand particularly, but here in Auckland we also do need to see the rise of rail. So please, it is by no means a negating of what government are proposing here. It's a significant enhancement that we're offering government in the submission that ourselves, Auckland Council, Auckland Transport, Greater Wellington, and I'm hearing Local Government New Zealand are offering. So with that, it is moved by myself and Councillor Bartley as a second. Can I put it to the vote? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Ryan, in particular, thank you for your work. Luke, for Auckland Transport, thank you. David, managing the team, thank you. We hope that you get to see your beach towel now.